We're going to move on to the sticky situations. We're still gardeningaz.org and the Kalamazoo Conservation District and Relief of Michigan. So Plant It Well, Chapter 3.
When the roots are wrong.
And it does happen. And it's an unfortunate situation, but the majority of new trees now are failing. Bear with us a minute here, because it is the majority, and I know that that sounds like that can't be true. But when you look at what it means for a tree to succeed or a shrub to succeed, then
then you know they're not.
So these trees have been in the ground for 20 years. Can you see that they rolled out of the ground with the root ball still intact, with very few roots having escaped that root ball?
Off the top.
I don't care whether someone blames the wind on blowing them over. They blew over because they did not have a root system. That tree failed. And what a shame to put 20 years into having something grow and then have it fail for on account of something that could have been corrected at planting. This one was in the ground for over 7 years.
Continuously restaking.
People driving by said, "Oh man, the car must have hit that." No car hit
fell over.
It just finally got big enough on top that it overbalanced what little roots it could have.
There's no root.
The roots were all wrapped around. Roots were all wrapped around itself. This tree in the middle, and this is all over the country. This is at the Getty Museum in California, outside of Los Angeles in California, and that middle sweet gum is on its way out. We'll revisit that one in a little bit. This pine, which was planted in the 70s and waited to do this until 2007, cost a lot of money to the person whose pine it was, because the arborist kept treating it for various things.
Yeah, it was being...
What it had was a girdling root. Its trunk had reached the size of the root that was wrapped around the outside of the root ball when it was planted. It was
slowly strangling it.
Same thing happened to this one, 20 years in the ground. Started to die at the top.
Beautiful white fir. Beautiful.
Our friend, the library director, said, "What's wrong with our fir?" I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but if it's dying in that pattern, I think I know what's going on." We'll revisit this one too, but this is now after I decided it really is gone. We'll take off some lower branches so I can show you what's up.
Dig into it.
We'll come back. So this has an outline called Planting Trees and Shrubs When the Roots Aren't Right. That also is available on our website, and we'll tell you where we are. We're starting with the problems that we see. We know that you already have the basics of a root system from what we've already talked about. So we're starting with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and their study that showed that trees were only living less than 10 years in a city, to which urban forestry responded with its own study saying, no, that's not right. They live 19 to 28 years.
Woohoo!
I'm sorry, 10 years, 19, 28 years, that is not...
For trees?
That is not what we expect of trees, especially when you understand that during those 10 to 28 years, they are growing poorly.
The whole time.
They never become what they could become. We'd rather look at what the U.S. Forestry Service has done with our aerial studies of 20 cities.
And it must be worse by now.
Oh yeah, it is, because this is going on 10 years since they did it.
Yep.
17 cities showed significant losses of canopy cover. What that means is we're losing foliage.
Big trees.
We're losing big trees, and the new trees are not growing to fill the gaps. Whoops. Whoa, sorry. So this Katsura, we know that's how big a Katsura should be in 20 years. If it's not that big, then something is wrong. This is how big a tricolor beech, which is not a little tree, you guys, should be in 20 years. If it's not that big, something is wrong. This is a swamp white oak, and it's 20 years old, and it should be that big, and we'll come back to it later because it's now showing signs of trouble.
Yep.
These are Norway maples. They were all planted at the same time. Can you tell that there's trouble there?
On all three.
Yeah. So the problems we see is nursery production, number one. Every time the plant reaches the size of the pot, they put it in a bigger pot, and they are not root pruning.
Nobody is root pruning. Every plant we've bought, woody plant, has not been root pruned.
We'll get into that in a little bit on the why, but it's during production that the failure starts. We used to do trees this way: bare root trees, in big bunches planted by people in suits and top hats.
Look at those flares and those roots. It's right there. You know right where to plant it.
You planted those, they stayed in the ground, they were done. Now,
same size tree,
but look at the pot that it's in. No root pruning's been done. It's probably been potted 3 times. Pot, not pruned, inside of pot, not pruned, inside of pot, not pruned.
Set deeper each time.
There's a wrap inside of a wrap inside of a wrap on these trees. But this is what nursery growers say that the public wants. It's certainly what our client Paul wants. He wants to be able to get a big tree right now, pick it up, put it in the van, and take it home. And what happens is those roots that need to grow wide get the edge of the pot and circle. They follow the gradient of water and go down. And it happens to perennials too. A peony will have a curved root system rather than out at 18 inches. It's 8 inches wide. So all that root is going around. So we had been doing exactly what they told us.
Slice the bottom off.
To take all of the congested roots.
And cut the sides.
So that there's no circle. We were doing that, but still finding problems. Because the main roots were still restricted. Never pruned. Inside there was a wrap. And this.
Like this.
Terrible, awful drawing that you see here. That's mine.
These are adventitious roots.
Those are adventitious roots. They should have been growing like this. And they should not have been growing from up above the flare, but because the trunk was buried, that grew some adventitious roots. That's a real tree. This is a 10-year in the ground willow, an ornamental willow, and the roots that you see that look like rope on top that have not enlarged where they join the trunk, those are those adventitious roots. The main roots, the flare roots, were trapped under each other, never grew out, never buttressed the tree. The stuff on top just acted as a hinge. At 10 years old, this tree was still
pivoting and
falling over. At 20 feet tall, still falling.
A willow.
Yeah. The same thing is what's going on with the fir. It started at the top. When you see the top center of a tree begin to die first, look for trouble at the roots. And so I've taken branches off of the bottom. The first year, it just had some death at the top, and then it was what you just saw.
Took 2.
So I started digging around the trunk. And I went, I said, no, I'm wrong. It's got flare roots there. But I dug a little further down and realized that, see the red down there? That's bark. And what else do you see down there?
What's this?
There's the cage and the handle on the cage. Do you see the level it should have been planted? So not only was it grown deep and planted with the cage, but it was planted deep. What you're looking at on the top here and here are adventitious roots. The flare roots are trapped below, and the trunk has run into
the cage,
the 20-year-old cage.
And it's strangled it.
And that's what killed it. Those are adventitious roots. And that's the cage.
They never buttress up. They never look big.
So it was planted
visually.
Right. It was planted a trowel too deep when they planted it, but it was grown too deep as well. They call that harvested deep is grown too deep, planted too deep is planted too deep. Poor baby.
Nah.
So it's the same thing as that willow. Those are adventitious roots. They're big, but they're adventitious roots. And this happens when they put these little tiny plants into small pots to grow them on, because these are expensive plants to grow, especially when they're grafted.
And you can't put it in a big pot. You're wasting nutrients and watering it when they first start on those little pots. They have to be in a little pot.
So the roots wrap, like we showed those beeches we showed you in the last chapter. The roots wrap around. Then when they repot it, they don't cut those roots or straighten them out, and they plant them deeper. So it's a wrap inside of a wrap inside of a wrap. So this pot, it's from a major grower, one of the best growers. This is a little dwarf juniper. It's in a 4-inch pot. It's up on the upper right. What you see here is now you can see the trunk. It was set in the pot with the trunk and its flare all the way at the bottom of the pot, and all of this root was up and around the plant. I spread it out, planted it, the plant did fine, but it wouldn't do that fine for long, not in the ground that way. And you can see more examples of this in James Urban's textbook, in the other references that we give you that show what happens when you ball and burlap and plant it too deep. See the wrapping roots. Our garage is full of corpses, we call them, of plants that we've taken out or people have brought to us that had these wrapped roots, and that's why they failed. When the trunk reaches that root, it's going to stop growing. So the potted up, the roots circle, they descend. Growers say that they plant the grafted plants with the little crook at the bottom. They say, oh, we have to plant those deep because people don't want to see the crook. People don't know crook from anything. That's not why they do it. They do it because it's easier to do it that way, and the plant is steadier in the pot when you stick it in deeper. So they used to put the plant at the top properly on the right with the new fill and the new pot below after they root pruned. Now they just put it to the bottom and they fill above, and that lets them do it on a conveyor belt. And this is what you have happen then. The buried trunk ends up being killed by its own roots wrapping around it. And that's what happened to this sweet gum. It took it 25 years, but it's run into that root and it suckered. It said, help. But now, could this have been done? Oh, a few years back, an arborist could have come and cut and chiseled away this root and might have saved the tree. But the tree already had major branch dieback, already had a constricted trunk. It was actually bowed inward down there. So you need to find the earlier symptoms, which we'll show you shortly. So this is what happens. We've rinsed the soil off. This is a young redbud. You can probably see, here's the level of soil down in here. All of this root grew up and wrapped around and is going to kill that tree later. And what do you do with it? You cut it off. You cut it off. Steve is more afraid to do this than I am. I say, no, there's the level that it was last planted. All of that root has to come off. If it's not flexible enough to bend it outward, cut it. We know the roots will grow. It's a redbud. It will grow quickly. So take them off. That's what's going on with the sweet gum in the middle at the Getty Museum. You see the root wrapped around the base? When you see the top center of the tree in trouble, that's when you have to see it right away. Then you need to go looking for the roots. Here's a young redbud tree planted 5 inches too deep. You can see the stain on the trunk. Take all that soil away, go down to the flare. Don't be afraid. Take them down. This is a little Coosa dogwood that was in the ground and it was in too deep. I'll come back to that later. But we've seen this over and over again. Our numbers are based on what we see out in the landscapes and what we see in our own. In 2014, we planted 56 shrubs and trees on this property. And 80% of them required major root reconfiguration, 80%. 5 years later, and this is all over. We work in Michigan primarily, but we work in Ohio, we work in Wisconsin, in Massachusetts, in California, and we see the same problems all over. These are the major nurseries that are growing the plants and sending them on to the smaller growers and the retail sellers. So no matter where you're getting your plants from, you're getting these problems. The last 2 large projects, there was 93%. There were 122 trees and shrubs we planted here at Sue's place, and 93% of them required major modification. And last week, I went and modified one of the ones that I thought was okay, but after watching it for 3 years said, nope, let's dig this one up. And sure enough, it still had a girdling root, because that's what's inside those pots, and that's going to kill the plant. This is a viburnum 10 years in the ground, and that was the root that was wrapped around the other roots, keeping them from growing. So what questions do you have about the problem that we're seeing, so that we can get on to more of the fixes? I've been talking about them as we go along, but what questions do we have now, Elizabeth?
We don't have any new questions at this
point.
Good,
then we're going to keep on moving and we'll show you more of what we do. I love those horses.
Yeah, they were so
now that you know what can go wrong, we're going to go on to more of the fixes.